I think it is time. I'm sorry I've got a bit of a frog in my throat, but I've got plenty of water here, so I hope I won't be inaudible. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. This is the second year of a 3-year cycle. The lectures that I gave before the summer vacation related to the relationship between religious belief and various issues to do with the understanding of the market economy as one of the integral kinds of institutions of a liberal social and political order. And this was, I started with that, not because it was the most logical thing to do, but it seemed to be the most topical thing to do after the Occupy movement and so forth in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I tried to address some of the issues about what do we mean by social justice, and do we have collective responsibility for inequalities that arise out of a system of free exchange and all that kind of thing. So the aim of last year's, academic year's lectures is to do with testing out the relationship between an understanding of the market economy and religious beliefs, particularly beliefs about values and principles and so forth. And this year rather, I'm going to look more directly at the relationship between a liberal understanding of a modern state and the role of religion within it, and whether religion has any place in the public deliberation about public policy and so forth in a modern state. So that's the general theme. And then next year I'm going to look at aspects of kind of personal morality seen from a liberal perspective, particularly the emphasis in liberalism on the importance of autonomy and so forth, and just sort of follow through how that liberal emphasis on certain kinds of human characteristics and virtues relates to a religious understanding of those characteristics and virtues. So over the 3 years, I think I would have covered all the dimensions. I'm not saying I've covered them well, but at least I hope it's going to be fairly encyclopedic by the time we get to the end of the whole cycle. I should say as well that there is a copy of the lecture available. I don't know whether you've got it yet, but if not, at the end of the lecture. And it's not my practice to just sort of read out a lecture, so it's more a question of the fact that the lecture is concerned with the topic I'm going to talk about today, but I'm not going to read it out as a sort of detailed disquisition. First of all, because I'm not very good at doing that. I can't read my own typing and writing very well from this sort of distance, and also because I think it probably makes for a slightly more lively delivery. But anyway, I mean that's up to you. All I'm saying is that there will be a printed version, but it doesn't correspond word for word with what I'm just about to say. The topic for this term, as I say, is the role of liberal institutions, political public institutions, and the law in relation to religious belief. And there's no doubt that I think two strands relating to religious belief are actually rather important for understanding modern liberalism. The first is that many modern liberals see the great virtue of liberalism as having put paid to what were called the wars of religion, which of course decimated Europe in the 16th and early 17th century and came to a rather messy end, but nevertheless some sort of conclusion in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which decreed, among many other things, that each state should take on the religion of the prince, cuius regio eius religio, that principle. And since that time, the as liberalism has emerged as an important political creed in Western Europe, many of the greatest sort of liberal thinkers have seen the great virtue of a liberal state as one that can act as a kind of solvent to religious diversity, religious conflict, and so on. And that if we can get to if we can have a sort of liberal political order, it will secure a place for religion, but it will also, in a sense, neutralize the socially and politically disruptive sides of religious belief. So that's one very strong strand in modern liberal self-understanding, that it's a way of dealing with religious pluralism, and other kinds of pluralism for that matter, but a way of dealing with religious pluralism that protects a right to religious belief while at the same time neutralizing the possible conflicts between those beliefs. And of course it does that partly, and this is a highly controversial issue, so I'm qualifying it a bit, and it's something we're going to come into looking at in much more detail. It does it partly by privatizing religion, that essentially in a liberal state you can have a right to the freedom of conscience, but that is a private thing. When religious belief is manifested in whatever way it is, whether it's praying facing Mecca 5 times a day or wearing jewelry or whatever it might be with religious significance, when it comes to the practice of religion, then that practice can legitimately be controlled and interfered with by the state because it is arguable that it affects other people. And if it has an adverse effect on other people or causes harm to other people or whatever it might be, then that is a basis for controlling the expression of religious belief. And this is where a lot of the fault line lies between a liberal understanding of politics and the role of religion. And it's neatly reflected in the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as you'll know, was largely incorporated into UK law in the Human Rights Act. And under Article 9 of the Human Rights Act, which falls into 2 parts, there is first of all a guarantee of an absolute right to religious belief. And not just religious belief, but philosophical beliefs of any sort. You can believe what you like according to the Human Rights Act. You have a basic right of belief of that sort. But what you don't have an absolute right to is a right to practice or act upon your religious beliefs. They have to be subject to, constrained by, the impact that that practice would have on other people. Now, in a way, many religious people may be quite happy with that. It seems on the face of it to be a fairly reasonable kind of compromise between an absolute right to belief and a conditional right on exercising the consequences of that belief, if I could put it that way. But at the same time, there are many religious thinkers particularly, and indeed perhaps more subtle liberals, who think that this is far from being a straightforward issue, in the sense that there are many ways of manifesting your religious belief that, in the view of those who hold those beliefs, are integral to the belief itself, like praying to facing Mecca 5 times a day, or whatever it might be, that there are certain beliefs and indeed certain forms of dress and so forth which are intrinsic to religious belief according to those who take this view. And therefore, to constrain the exercise, the manifestation of a belief is the very same thing as constraining the belief itself, because the manifestation is an integral part of the belief. You can't be a Muslim without praying 5 times a day, and so on. It's not a kind of add-on, it's not a matter of choice. It's something that you are required to do by your religious belief. Now, given that, to say, well, look, you're not doing this because of whatever reason it might be, this adversely affects others in some way or another, to say that is actually to constrain what is supposed to be absolute, namely the freedom of belief. If you're not free to manifest your beliefs, when those manifestations are an integral part of the belief, then the state is actually infringing what is supposed to be an absolute right. So one of the issues that we'll have to talk about over the next few weeks is how do we get ourselves through this kind of issue if someone says, well, look, my doing this, my public action in doing this, is an integral part of my absolute right to religious belief. How can the state, how can the law in a liberal society deal with that? And of course, many of the cases that have made the news over the past few years have been to do with an individual claiming that particular manifestation of a belief is integral to the belief itself, and others denying that. And the question then is, how do you resolve that kind of dilemma? The person concerned thinks that behaving in this way, wearing this dress or whatever, is an integral part of their absolute right to religious freedom, and others would reject that. So how do we navigate around that kind of issue? I'm not going to propose a solution now, but I will do later on in the lecture course. So that's one strand of the role of religion in liberalism, that liberalism saw itself as a solvent to religious diversity, religious conflict. But it did it by recognizing an absolute right for everyone to have freedom of religious and philosophical belief, without really addressing what has now become a very difficult issue in Western societies about the manifestation of those beliefs. It treated religious belief as a private thing, not as something with a public side and impact on others. And of course it's easy to understand why that was so, because when initially liberalism began to emerge as a kind of doctrine, people in Western Europe lived largely in non-diverse societies, whereas now, of course, we have an incredible degree of diversity of belief and so forth, and dealing with that diversity in a way that's consistent with liberal principles is, as we found, extremely difficult. But I said there were two strands to this, the relationship between liberalism and religious belief. And the second strand is the fact that, oddly enough, in the view of how many liberals today are rather disparaging about religion, religion actually played a considerable part in the growth and establishment of a kind of liberal view of politics and the law. You only have to think about probably the greatest liberal thinker of all, John Locke, in the Second Treatise on Civil Government. That is a book that is totally infused with a religious outlook about the role of property in relation to the role of property, in relation to the role of labour, and so forth, that there was an intrinsic religious dimension between Locke's justification of a set of political and legal arrangements which nowadays, looking back, we would call liberal, and religion. And so it wasn't always the case that religious belief and liberalism were uneasy bedfellows. Certainly in the early days of a kind of liberal view of politics and the law, religion played quite a considerable part. And indeed, this is true into the 19th century, where, I mean, when people talk about 19th century liberalism, they think quite rightly of a thinker like John Stuart Mill, but there were other substantial religious thinkers in the 19th century who thought of themselves equally as liberals, the most obvious one being the Oxford philosopher Thomas Hill Green, who had an enormous intellectual influence in the latter part of the 19th century, so much so that a very successful novel, Robert Elsmere, was written about the life of Green and his impact on people and so forth. And Green was a liberal and a deeply committed religious believer, a kind of evangelical end of the Church of England religious believer. So it would be wrong to say, well, we can trace the evolution of liberalism, as it were, in total isolation from religious belief, because religious belief has often played an enormous role in underpinning some of the arguments for the liberalism that we're talking about. And that's an important thing just to remember. The obvious counter-argument to that, just to sort of state it for the moment, and I'll come back to it at a later time, is that that if you say, well, liberalism is heavily indebted to religious understandings of things like human dignity and how human dignity might be protected by rights and human freedom and so on and so forth. If you say religion played an enormous role in underpinning those liberal ideas, I think there's no arguing that it did. But the critic will say, to say that, well, that's how things were then, therefore, in a sense, modern liberalism must incorporate religious beliefs in a similar way, is to commit what's called the genetic fallacy. That is to say that the validity of a point of view is not determined by how it arose or who argued for it or whatever. The validity of a point of view, of a doctrine or an ideology or whatever, is entirely down to whether there are good arguments now for it or whether the arguments are not very good. So you can't sort of say, looking back on the history of liberalism and religion, that they were at one time intertwined, therefore they must in some sense still be intertwined, because the critic will say this is false, it commits the genetic fallacy. And there are lots of debates around, both in Parliament and outside Parliament, about things like rights and so forth, and people will get up and say quite correctly, well, the Human Rights Convention is actually based upon religious beliefs and religious principles and so forth. Well, it may have been, but if it is entirely dependent on those, and if in the West religious belief is declining, to, as it were, assert the centrality of religious belief to doctrines about rights and so forth, is to undermine those rights, because the moral, intellectual case for it is declining as religion is declining. And that links to another feature of the link between religion and liberalism, and it's this. I think it would be fair to say that most liberal thinkers of the 20th century are very surprised to see, as it were, the persistence of religious belief. They thought, many of them, that with the growth of science, with the growth of secularization and so forth, the problems posed by the relationship between liberalism and the political order, that those problems would, as it were, wither on the vine as religious belief declined. And many of them were, looking forward to that day when, out of a liberal political setup which allowed not just religious belief but freedom of scientific investigation and so forth, that out of that would grow a secular culture and would relegate religion, if it still existed, to a purely private sphere. Now, whatever you think about the relationship between liberalism and religion, we're clearly not in that position, but it's certainly a position that many liberal thinkers thought that we would be in. Now, there's a way in which religion poses an immense challenge to liberalism, and it's this, if I can sort of sketch it fairly lightly for the moment, because it's something I want to discuss more fully next time, but it's this. The religious person, from the point of view of a non-religious liberal, wants to bring religion into the public realm, to justify or to reject items of public policy on religious grounds, and that this is in some sense illegitimate. And we have to think of how and why it's illegitimate. As I say, I want to deal with that more next time, but it's certainly a strong theme that the public realm should be, to use sort of philosophical jargon, should be neutral between conceptions of the good. We all have our view about what is it that makes sense of life, what is it religious belief or a scientific way of looking at the world or whatever. And the liberal view is seemingly that we must push towards a state in which the state is neutral between contending overall doctrines. Otherwise, we shall be back with the kind of fragmentation of society that occurred during the religious wars. That if what philosophers call comprehensive doctrines, like Christianity or Islam or whatever, or for that matter, a thesis of secular reason, if comprehensive doctrines are brought into the justification of public policies, then because people disagree about these things, we shall end up with a more fractured and diverse and sort of criterionless society. That is, so we won't know how to make decisions because we'll have all these contending general doctrines trying to determine what should happen. Now, if there's some truth in that kind of view, this raises the very difficult question of, if you're living in a liberal society, then if you're religious as well, the policy outcome through the liberal institutions may be something that you find, from a religious point of view, deeply disturbing or challenging or immoral, for that matter. And there are a lot of examples of this in recent years, that the liberal political process throws up certain kinds of outcomes which are very challenging to people with religious beliefs. And this is true across Western Europe, not just of the UK. I'm just think of the legislation in France about wearing the veil, the present sort of controversies over the niqab and whether you can wear it in court and so on, all of those sorts of things. But it goes deeper than that as well. There was the case of the Northern Irish guest house owners who were strongly evangelical Christians and were confronted by, well, not confronted, they were approached by a couple of potential guests for their guest house, two men who wanted to hire a room in their house, and they refused, and they were taken to court. Because if you're selling some service to a customer, then it's unlawful to discriminate against different customers on grounds of things like religious belief, in just the same way as you can't discriminate in terms of colour or gender in relation to potential guests, that if you're offering a public service, then you are bound by certain kinds of legal practices that govern the public realm. It's not just a matter of your choice. I don't want this to be happening in my house, even though it's my home, because I've turned my home into a piece of sort of public resource as a guest house owner. There was the case of the Catholic adoption agencies which refused to present gay couples with adoptive babies, both, and that led to the closure of these adoption agencies, because the church wouldn't, in order to stay in business, and that's not the right word, but in order to stay active in this field, they didn't want to do on grounds that they thought were morally wrong. So there are outcomes of liberal legislation, if you like, protecting equality, protecting non-discrimination, protecting all sorts of things like that, the so-called protected characteristics as they are in the Equality Act. That those different sorts of human characteristics are given legal protection, and then you have to work out what does that mean in terms of things like letting rooms and so on and so forth, running adoption agencies, etc. That all of these things follow from the general liberal principle, which is sometimes called civic egalitarianism, that all citizens of a society should have exactly the same rights and have exactly the same duties and obligations, and that it's wrong on at least most versions, but not all versions of liberalism, it's wrong to make exceptions, or what the usual term that's used is accommodation, that we should not accommodate people who wish to have some kind of exemption from the requirements of the rights and duties that are characteristic of a liberal political order, such as the one that we're currently living in. And that you should not, it's wrong for the state to provide accommodation to religious belief or exemptions from the requirements of egalitarian civic rights and duties. And the analogy that's often drawn here is this, that we don't think it's right, or at least I haven't heard anyone say that it is right, for the state to support what you might call expensive preferences. That if I have, if I say it's absolutely essential to my well-being, without it I shall wither and die, as it were, if I don't have a bottle of champagne every other day and caviar to eat and so forth, and I speak as someone who likes neither actually, but we wouldn't think it was the state's job to make some special provision for expensive preferences like that. And in a sense, a set of religious beliefs in the public world, like I'm not going to allow you to hire this room, that those are like expensive preferences. We don't make accommodation to expensive preferences. We shouldn't make accommodation to religious exceptions in the view of liberal civic egalitarians, that citizenship should be a common thing, it should be something that we all share, and we share the same rights and we share the same duties, and there should be few, if any, exemptions. Well, of course, there are loads of exemptions at the moment, ranging from turban wearing and the unresolved issues about Islamic dress, to halal methods of slaughter which apply to the Muslim community, or a similar method of slaughter that applies in the Jewish community, and so forth. So at the moment we do make a lot of exceptions. Most of them go unchallenged, unlike those to do with sexuality of the sort that I mentioned. And the only way we can deal with those sorts of things is to, well, hope that as time goes on, as it were, the number of people practicing these activities will just diminish. If not, then the state, to preserve the idea of common citizenship, might well have to legislate against kind of minority practices which are legal within those minority communities. But we don't want to see it extending, certainly, on this view, nor do we want to actually legislate if we can avoid it, because it would be enormously disruptive and it would keep Parliament occupied for many, many hours and days, I think. So we do make these exceptions, but the question is, on what grounds? Are there any good grounds for making these exceptions for these forms of accommodation? You know, why should religion be tolerated if the upshot of religion is to undermine a sense of common citizenship and a set of common rights and duties? That's the challenge, as it were. So what we find is that a liberal political and legal order can produce outcomes that a religious person might find distressing, and so on. And in the view of critics of liberalism, this is something that just has to be acknowledged. And it has to be acknowledged in the following way. Religious beliefs, whatever you think about them, are, it seems obviously, central to some people's sense of identity, some people's sense of the worthwhileness of life. Indeed, it may be the source of thinking why life is worthwhile, and so on. And if your sense of what it is to be the sort of person you are is bound up with, and it'd be difficult to see how it wasn't, with your religious belief, then how do you, as it were, come to accept the outcomes of political processes and legal processes which may well undermine that sense of identity, that sense of the worthwhileness of life as you see it? And we have to have some kind of recognition, in the view of critics of liberalism, we have to have some kind of recognition of the fact that the costs of being a citizen in a liberal society may be very unfairly distributed. That for a secular-minded person, then the costs of living in a liberal society with an equal idea of citizenship, of common rights and duties, is not problematic. But it is problematic for a religious person who may well be quite happy that the secular-minded person has a set of arrangements that suit him or her, without at all thinking that they want to be part of that, because the effects of those secular arrangements will be to undermine their own sense of identity and worth. Now, if the state, as it were, only recognizes religion as a purely private matter, then the psychological cost of being a citizen in that society may well be increased to a very high degree compared with the secular person. And what is it about liberalism that gives it the privilege of producing this outcome? I mean, what is the justification of a liberal political order if it produces outcomes that threaten my sense of identity, my sense of worth as a human being, and so forth? There was a philosopher now died about 8 years ago, I suppose, who called religious beliefs ground projects. That is to say, they're absolutely fundamental to those who hold them, which he didn't, but they were central to those who held them. And that it's one of the big defects of liberalism that it isn't at all sensitive to people's ground projects as it sees it. That the requirement of civic egalitarianism rides roughshod in this view over ground projects or basic religious beliefs and so forth. And here I'm talking about the philosopher Bernard Williams, who one of the most important mid-20th century philosophers, and he argued in a paper called Moral Luck that in fact it's just a mistake to think that you can get people a sense of loyalty to liberal institutions if those institutions require you to, as it were, subordinate all your identity-creating beliefs to the requirements of those institutions. That we cannot accept, he says, and you'll find the quote, well, this is what he says: there can come a point at which it is quite unreasonable for a man, and he said man, to give up, in the name of the impartial good ordering of the world of moral agents, something which is a condition of his having any interest in being around in the world at all. That is to say, your view of your religious belief may be so fundamental to you that to have it undermined in a fairly predictable way by liberal institutions may well, as it were, be so drastic as to destroy the reason why you think it's worthwhile living a life at all. And this comes as a bit of a shock to some liberals, and I'll finish in a minute so that we can perhaps have a few questions and so deal with some of these things in more detail next time. But it comes as a bit of a shock to liberals because they think that liberal law, if you like a set of rights and duties and protections for freedom and so on, leaves everybody kind of untouched, in the sense that each person has the same kind of freedom from coercion. Each person has the same civil and political rights. No one has more than others. No one has less than others. And that is a reasonable kind of position to be in. But there are critics of liberalism, or liberals who have sort of seen some of these issues a bit more clearly, who accept that liberalism can in fact be of an almost totalitarian sort. This is Stephen Macedo, for example, in his book Liberal Virtues. He says, to accept the liberal settlement is to accept institutions, ideas and practices whose influence over our lives and our children's lives will be broad, deep and relentless. Family life, religious life, and paradigmatically private associations take on the colour of liberal values. So in Macedo's view, liberalism will transform our understanding of, well, to use his examples, family life, religious life, and private associations, voluntary groups of all sorts, because they will only be tolerated if they fit into the kind of set of liberal rights which is being taken as fundamental. Now, this is the issue that I'll finish on, but this is the topic really for next time. If liberalism has that effect, that it transforms all these aspects of our lives over time, what is it that privileges a liberal understanding over, say, a religious understanding, or it might be something else, but let's say a religious understanding? What is it that gives liberalism a particular kind of standing in all of this, so that you can say, well, you've got to be governed under this framework because that's the liberal position. But what is it that justifies the liberal position? And what won't work is this, as an answer to that question. The liberal, again, if you turn up most textbooks on liberalism, will want to say that a liberal political order depends upon consent, and it depends upon the justification both of basic principles and basic policies that emerge from those principles and values in political life and in legal interpretation and so forth. That liberalism is committed to an idea of justifying itself. Well, it has to get on and do it then, because what you can't say is, well, liberalism is just a kind of choice, like any other choice that you might make, but it's a choice that has, if Macedo is right, wide-ranging ramifications on other civil institutions, other forms of civic life. And if it has that effect, then we can't just say, it's all a matter of kind of existential choice, because what it means is that I and other liberals are using the consequences of our choice to override the consequences of your choices if you are religiously minded citizens of this society. The liberalism has to be about justification and argument. It can't just be regarded as, one of a number of relatively valid alternatives, and we happen to have chosen this one. This is what Jeremy Waldron, who's a professor at, was at New York, now in Oxford, says. Liberals demand that the social order should, in principle, be capable of explaining itself at the tribunal of each person's understanding. That what justifies a liberal order has to be capable of being endorsed by each member of that society, because it depends upon consent. It doesn't depend on the imposition by power. That's always been the liberal story. But many people sympathetic to liberals think that this is just a kind of illusion, that liberalism itself has to be seen as one choice amongst others, which cannot be given some kind of foundational and ultimately authoritative role in society. And if it doesn't have that kind of role, or if it's difficult to justify that kind of role, on what grounds then can you, from a liberal perspective, rule out of court religious points of view, religious arguments, and so forth? Well, that's what I want to try and concentrate on next time. What is it, if anything, that privileges liberalism, and what sort of response, if any, can be made to that? So it's 1:45. We've got about a quarter of an hour. I think we have to be gone by 2, but yeah.
This word liberal, it seems to be based on the idea of individual freedom and equality. But the situation politically looks to many of us as if the idea of individual freedom is being used to destroy collective freedom. some hidden power really behind government that is using the old game of divide and rule. It's about destroying people's ability to unite about anything. That's what it looks like. And so this concept of individual freedom being used to attack collective freedoms it's a very unpleasant thing, because most of with the way liberalism is pushed, it's always pushed on moral arguments.
Yeah.
And in those moral arguments, there seems to be massive moral inversions. You get these things like humanitarian war. I mean, these kind of contradictions are central to the liberal project, and therefore it looks to me, as a Christian, like a version of Satanism. Okay?
Right. We'll perhaps take 2 or 3 questions.
To what extent do you consider political correctness as an emerging threat to both liberalism and religion?
There's a chap down here.
Can I go back to the issue of adoption of children? I assume that, well, you would not be able to adopt, 2 80-year-olds would not be able to adopt a child.
No.
And one would assume that the pragmatic argument is that they probably wouldn't live to bring the child up. And you could also argue that 2 70-year-olds or 2 80-year-olds could not produce a child. Now, the same argument could be used to say 2 men or 2 women on their own could not produce a child. So, if that argument was used, would liberals accept that you should give a child to only a man and a woman? But if the religious argument is used, then that's not acceptable.
Well, if I can take that... Sorry? I'll try and take those 3 questions, otherwise I shall forget what the first person said, and then we'll have another round. I mean, on the last question, what I think it turns on, using the example of elderly people and what's the difference between that and a gay couple, I think it turns upon what constitutes a good argument for an exception or an accommodation. In this case, an accommodation to, not to religion, but to the gay couple, whether homosexual or it's what makes a good argument, and whether that argument, as it were, carries weight in the forum of public opinion. And I think we've got to the position at the moment where it's actually quite difficult to pursue a kind of moral argument, because nobody seems to know quite where to stand, what sort of foundations to stand on for the argument that they have. So, for example, to take a quite different case, raising rather different issues, in the debates in the House of Lords on gay marriage, the strongest argument seemed to be, in the view of those who were putting it forward, well, it's modern to think like this. Well, it may be, but I mean, this is hardly a kind of penetrating moral analysis, and I think we have to have, a bit more to, I voted for gay marriage, but I think you've got to have a bit more in the way of argument than just saying, well, this is the modern position. So all I'm saying is, in terms of things going through a legislature, you've got to have some kind of argument that's capable of some sort of public scrutiny, and thereby hangs the difficulty for the role of religion, because critics of religion will say, look, I can present the public realm, the public space with my arguments, because they're all secular arguments, they are all about things that we all know and understand, whereas you, the religious person, and I mean, I don't accept this, but I mean, I'm just pursuing the argument, the religious person is invoking forms of moral authority that A, I don't accept, and B, are not part of the whole public discourse of the community. And if you say, you can claim what authority you like for your religious belief, but it's going to be confined to those who accept that authority and cannot be, as it were, part of the deliberation in the public realm, which in a sense comes back to the previous person's point about individual freedom. The fundamental reason why individual and collective freedom fall out of liberalism in the way they do is that in the view of liberals, there isn't an end goal or purpose of human life that we all accept. We differ about these things. And any kind of collective good has to rest upon, I talked about this last term, some kind of collective good has to rest upon some sort of agreement that the collective good represents what we want or would like to see or think is right. But we don't have the moral resources anymore, in the view of the critic, to actually say what this collective good is. So, for the liberal, what you should do is to, as it were, delegate freedom down to the individual level, where I am free to do what I want, so long as I don't harm others, and there's something about this in the lecture notes, so long as I don't harm others, but that there is no way in which other people, short of using the harm principle, there is no way in which other people can criticise the end or goal or purpose that I have. These are entirely subjective choices. And what you can't do is to interfere with other people on the basis of your subjective choice. If they're harming you, that's a matter for public authorities, as it were. But if they're not harming on you, you cannot impose something on them against their will. And I think that's the key, in a sense, that we have the issue of collective freedom presupposes that we have a view about what sort of good it is that collective freedom would allow us to pursue. But in the view of the liberal, we don't. But we'll come back to that another week, and I can't now for the life of me remember what the first question was. Can who? Yeah, that was yours. Yeah, sorry. It was.
I was the one talking about
political correctness. Yeah. Well, I think there is a difficulty here, and it's also connected with the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act. I wouldn't say it was principally about political correctness, but it's undoubtedly the case that it's more difficult these days to be able to describe what you think is wrong about something that is happening, in your view, in a way that you want to describe it. There was quite a good example of this when the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, went to Spain, and he wanted to preach a sermon on sexuality. And he said that he was inhibited in this sermon because what he wanted to say about gay relationships was not possible to say under Spanish law. Now, that isn't exactly political correctness, but there is the view that we can't, as it were, say what we think if someone else takes offence at what we think, and could even go to law about it. And I think that's certainly an issue. And again, it's something we'll be coming back to. But I think it's broader than just political correctness. It's to do with what counts as offence and what sorts of offences, if any, we should be trying to control. Okay, so that was we've got 5 minutes, so a couple of quick questions.
Thank you very very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm particularly supportive of the idea of liberal values in the general sense, because I believe that they are the only values that really serve a pluralist and diverse society, which I believe that we're going into in greater and greater degree, because after all, diversity is a natural phenomenon. So I think that the criterion, or the criteria that we use in judgment about which social system we prefer, I think it should be which is the best system that serves diversity and pluralism.
So one more question. Sorry, I think it's... Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I understand that so far the discussion has been relatively abstract. To make it somewhat more specific and subject-based, I think that most of us would consider Britain a relatively liberal society in comparison to many others in the world. But what we've so far talked about is the idea of this distinction between those who have religious belief and those who have liberal beliefs, and how they can conflict in a society that's meant to be very open and liberal. But I think if you actually consider Britain, what you're looking at is a society that's liberal but not purely liberal. For example, if you look at what days people have off work as holiday, those are in effect somewhat Anglican Christian traditions seeping through. Not only that, the Anglican Church has certain exemptions from equality law. So what I wanted to say is that I think it's worth noting that in this discussion you can't be as stark as liberal society, liberal values for a diverse society that is clearly coming in the future. You have to understand that society is quite a gradual developing thing, and that, you know, if you look around you, you still have the kind of the note marks of a very Christian society and what is becoming a more diverse society with Hindus and Muslim people and Jewish people. So I just think it's worth noting that to be so stark is possibly to oversimplify the situation.
I mean, I agree with you up to a point, but the point is quite an interesting point, I think, where I don't agree with you. It's fine to have that kind of position, and I suppose that's roughly my own position, except that when it comes down to legislating, you can't legislate, in a sense, in a bit of a fudge. That we can somehow get these principles all ticking along in the same way. At some point, do you or don't you allow gay couples to adopt babies? You can't say, well, up to a point, Lord Copper. You either do or you don't. And legislation, in a sense, pushes you to make a decision when, in fact, the social reality, as you're suggesting, and I agree with you, may not be so cut and dried, but and go back to the gay couple with the guest house. I mean, either they're acting legally or illegally. What kind of law should we have, if any, in those circumstances? So I think it is a case of I fully accept what you say, and the previous lady as well, about pluralism and diversity. And sorry, I keep saying this, I'll come on to that next week. But there is an issue here about the relationship between liberalism and pluralism. But there comes a point when, in Parliament, you have to say, well, it's this or it's that. And you can't, as it were, fudge it. Because, and I think this is an interesting feature of where we are now, and it applies to the question about pluralism as well, a moment or two ago, is that years ago you might have said, obviously we weren't such a liberal society, but you might have said, we lived in a society with a liberal ethos. And within that ethos, quite a lot of fudging of decisions could take place. So, for example, if you take the guest house owner, the two owners, man and wife, might say to the gay couple, look, we're not comfortable with this, but you just go down the road to Mrs. Smith and she will accommodate you, or something like that. I mean, I'm sure a great deal of that kind of thing happened, that decisions could be fudged, rightly or wrongly. But with the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, we've moved from ethos to rules. And when you have rules, you know, issues of enforceability, of justiciability, and so forth come out. And you can't make fudges anymore. Fudges are a possibility within an ethos, but they're not a possibility within a set of rules when these rules have, take legislative form and there are, punishments and so forth prescribed for an infringement of those rules. And this again is a case of where you have to be one side of the fence or the other, because there isn't really a middle way, short of making exceptions like, well, we have this law, except it won't apply to Northern Irish guest house owners. It's hopeless doing that. But in a sense, the whole thing turned on legislatively on that, in that the then government sort of promulgated regulations which a lot of Irish peers in the House of Lords voted against, because they thought there should have been an exemption for people like this couple. But I mean, there are lots and lots of people in lots and lots of situations who are disadvantaged by the law, not because they want to break the law, but it's difficult for them to do the right thing and stay within the law as they see it. But we can't make exceptions for them all. And what we have to think about doing is, well, who do we make exceptions for and on what grounds? I think that's the key. And we, in a plural society, it's not an easy question to answer, but I will try and deal with that a bit more next time. Now we have to go, I'm afraid. Thank you.